Welcome back, Highlanders, to the third and final lecture video for Chapter 8. And as promised last time, we're going to pick it up with this idea of inflation. So inflation is just an increase in the general level of prices, or often referred to as the percent change in prices as measured by the price index. So just to be very clear here, inflation is not just one price going up or the price of a popular commodity going up, right? It is an increase in the general level of all prices as measured by that price index. So again, inflation is just the percent change. So if you're trying to calculate inflation, it's equal to the new price index. So maybe the price index in the current year minus the old price index, or that price index in the base year divided by the old price index. So again, the inflation rate is just the percent change in prices, and so we calculate it the same way we calculate a percent change in anything else. It's just the new minus the old divided by the old, and we're using our price index here as our way of measuring how much prices have changed. So again, it's not necessarily an increase in all prices, so all prices don't have to go up in order for inflation to happen, right? Again, it's just got to be an increase in the price index. Right, so some prices could have gone up while other prices have stayed the same or maybe even gone down a little bit, right? As long as you have an overall general increase in the level of prices, then you're going to have inflation. And the problem with inflation for us as consumers is it causes the value of our dollars to decrease, right? So with inflation, the same amount of money can buy a lot less than it could buy before, or the purchasing power of our money goes down. So if you're somebody who has saved a lot of money and you've got a lot of money stored up in, say, a savings account or a bank account somewhere, and inflation happens, it's going to kind of erode some of the power of what your savings can buy. So with that in mind, it could be a potential hazard to hold on to money in the form of money during a time period when inflation is either going up or expected to go up, right? And another thing I want you to know about inflation is that these high rates of inflation that are dangerous to consumers are almost always associated with large swings in the inflation rate, right? So what this means is that if inflation is increasing kind of slowly and steadily, then you can expect inflation to stay low. But inflation increases rapidly, then decreases rapidly, and again exhibits these wild or large swings, then you can expect inflation to be high over time. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and graph out a couple different kinds of inflation rates, talk about which ones economists like versus which ones they don't like so much. All right, so again, we're going to exit the full screen mode here so we can use different colors. So again, if you're looking at what happens to prices over time, we're looking at time down here. And again, we're looking at the inflation rate or changes in the dollars, or again, you can think of it as changes in the price index up here on the vertical axis, right? So when economists talk about inflation rate that's good, they want an inflation rate that is low and relatively steady. Maybe an inflation rate that looks something like this. So economists would say that this is a good inflation rate. If an economist were to die and go to heaven, this is what the inflation rate would look like in that economist's heaven, right? Now, what economists do not want to see, because this is dangerous or hazardous to the economy, are inflation rates that look something like this. And to do that one in red, let's try that again. So inflation rates that look something like this, where you have these wild swings, because these wild swings lead to really high, or what we are going to call hyperinflation. So again, this is what economists would say is a bad inflation rate. If an economist were to die and go to hell, which people tell economists to do all the time, right, then this is what the inflation rate would look like in hell for that economist, right? So again, some issues with inflation is that it erodes the purchasing power of our money or makes our savings worth less. And again, when you have these wild swings in inflation rate, you tend to have these really high rates of inflation that reduce the power of those savings. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and watch a short video clip just for amusement's sake. This is from the movie Austin Powers, International Man of Mystery, where Dr. Evil is going to try to ransom the world, and he's going to ask for a certain amount of money that was a lot of money back when he was operating in, say, the 1960s, but he's been frozen since then and just recently reanimated, and he doesn't realize that because of inflation, that amount of money really isn't worth that much anymore. Let's take a look.
Oh, hell, let's just do what we always do. Hijack some nuclear weapons and hold the world hostage. Yeah? Good. Gentlemen, it's come to my attention that a breakaway Russian republic, Krepelakistan, is about to transfer a nuclear warhead to the United Nations in a few days. Here's the plan. We get the warhead, and we hold the world ransom for $1 million.
Don't you think we should maybe ask for more than $1 million? $1 million isn't exactly a lot of money these days. Virtucon alone makes over $9 billion a year.
Really? Mm-hmm. It's a lot. Right, okay, people, you have to tell me these things, all right? I've been frozen for 30 years, okay? Throw me a frickin' bone here. I'm the boss. Need the info. Okay, then. We hold the world ransom for $100 billion.
All right, so from the time period that he was frozen, $1 million was worth a lot more. Because of inflation over the years, $1 million is certainly now worth a lot less than it used to be. So he's going to have to ask for more money for that plan to be worth it. All right, so with that in mind, let's take a look at this idea of high inflation being related to large swings in the inflation rate from some U.S. history here. And this is a graph that comes from your textbook for those of you who are following along. But between 1956 and 1965, you can see that in this time period, inflation stayed relatively low and stable. Right? It never ever really got higher than 5%. And therefore, the average annual rate of inflation was only about 1.6%. Right? Also, from 1983 to 2011, right, again, inflation also stays relatively stable for the most part, and therefore inflation never really got out of control, and the average rate was about 2.9%. But during the 1970s, we had this time period where inflation started to have these, again, wild fluctuations that we talked about, the kind of thing that economists don't want to see, and that's when inflation was pretty high for this country's standards at about 9.2%. Right, so again, the more you see these wild swings in inflation, then the more likely you're going to see high inflation overall or this hyperinflation. Whereas again, if inflation stays relatively stable or level, right, you're not going to see that high inflation over time. Right. So with that in mind, let's take a look at why this high inflation could be problematic. So why is this such a big deal? After all, when prices go up, your wages usually tend to go up with it. Right, so what are some particular problems that are associated with this high and variable inflation? As it turns out, there are 3 of them. First of which is inflation reduces investment. Right, an uncertain future in general tends to reduce investment. So when there's a lot of price uncertainty out there, in other words, when that inflation rate is moving in that wild pattern, you don't know what your money's going to be worth down the road, so you're going to be less likely to save or invest that money down the road, right? You might be more likely to actually spend money as quickly as possible if you think that hyperinflation is coming, because again, that same amount of money is going to be able to buy a lot less in, say, future months or years, depending on how quickly that inflation is occurring, right? So again, one problem is that it tends to reduce investment. Remember from Chapter 2, investment is one of those things that allows our economy to grow into the future or expand out that production possibilities curve. A second problem is that distorts the information delivered by prices. So prices deliver a lot of information to us that helps us reach that equilibrium, right? For example, if there's a crop freeze and therefore there's fewer oranges out there to be had, then the price of oranges are going to go up. And that's going to encourage orange producers to go out there and make more oranges at a time when we need oranges the most. Right? At the same time, it's going to incentivize consumers to buy fewer oranges at a time when we might need to conserve on oranges the most. Right? So again, prices deliver that kind of information that keeps us in that equilibrium. But if you have these wild swings in inflation rate and prices are going all over the place, then people might not know how to respond. In other words, if an orange producer sees a huge increase in the price of their oranges, they might decide it's a good idea to go out there and produce more oranges. But at the same time, that might be the result of there just being a huge increase in the price of everything, and therefore they might not make more money producing more oranges, and the economy might not want or need more oranges at this time. Right? So again, it could create some misallocation of our productive resources as people are responding to price changes that they think are a reflection of people's desire, when in reality are just a reflection of this hyperinflation that is corrupting the market. And then the third one is that it results in less productive use of resources, right? So it results in less productive use of resources. And what we mean by that is that inflation is a problem that we have to try to overcome. And the more time or effort that people spend trying to, say, protect their savings from inflation, well, the less time and effort they can spend engaging in business activity, making their products faster, better, and cheaper. Right. So to give you an example, during post-World War I, Germany experienced some hyperinflation that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. And during that time, people would actually close down their stores at in the morning and do that so they could go shopping, because inflation was so rampant that prices at the end of the day would actually be higher than they were at the beginning of the day. So people would shut down their businesses to try to go shopping at other businesses, because they knew if they waited till after their businesses closed, then they'd have to pay more for stuff. Right? Well, if they're shutting down their businesses, then they're not out there serving the public or making any money themselves. Right? So again, the more effort you spend trying to protect your money from the effects of inflation, well, then the less time, effort, and money you're spending, again, improving your products or satisfying customers. So I know a lot of people have been watching a lot of Netflix and Hulu and things like that during this time period. So with that in mind, there's a movie that at the least time of this recording is on Netflix called Bad Boys 2 with Martin Lawrence and Will Smith. I guess anticipation of that sequel that's recently come out. And so in watching that movie, there's a part that kind of reminds me of this whole less productive use of resources thing. And that is that there's a drug dealer who is storing a bunch of money up in his attic until he can get it laundered and put into the bank. And the problem is that he goes up there and he's very upset to see that while he's storing a bunch of money in the attic, he sees that rats are eating that money. And so he gets mad, he starts shooting his gun off at all the rats, and then he points at his subordinate and he says, "This is a stupid problem to have." And it is, right? If you're a drug dealer, there's a lot of things you have to worry about. You got to worry about protecting your shipments from getting caught by the police. You got to worry about rival drug dealers or gangs. Right? There's a lot of things that you have to worry about as a drug dealer. One of the things you shouldn't have to worry about is rats eating the money that you made by selling drugs. That's kind of what inflation is like. It's like rats eating away at your money because it makes your money worth less. And again, when you have to deal with that problem, then there's other problems that you can't tackle. So again, it's kind of a stupid problem to have when there's a bunch of other things that you need to worry about when it comes to running your business or getting the most out of your life. So again, the three problems of inflation: it reduces investment, it distorts that information delivered by prices, and results in less productive use of resources as you spend more time dealing with inflation and less time doing things that would otherwise be more productive. So make sure you know those problems of inflation, right, for a quiz or exam. Right? And also be able to calculate the inflation rate, like an example in this problem here. It says that the consumer price index in 2006 was 150 and the CPI in 2016 was 165. Then the rate of inflation between 2006 and 2016 would be, and remember the formula here, when you're calculating inflation, it is, or the inflation rate, is equal to the new price index minus that old price index divided by the old price index. So in this particular case, right, our new price index is 165, our old price index is 150, and then we divide that by 150. So again, if you calculate that out, that should be 15 over 150, which is equal to 1/10 or 10%. So that would be the answer you're looking for on this one. So again, make sure you can do a calculation like that on the exam. Other than those labor market definitions that we talked about earlier, this is, I think, the only other calculation in Chapter 8 that you're going to need to know how to do. Again, it's just a percent change in prices, new minus the old divided by the old. All right, so what causes inflation? We know that it can be bad, especially when it's wild and out of control like that, right? And we know some of the problems that are associated with it. We also know how to calculate it. So let's talk about what causes it. Well, one thing that can cause inflation is when demand rises faster than supply, right? So remember those double shift questions we did in Chapter 3, right? Remember that if demand were to go up, then that makes quantity go up and price go up. Now, if supply were to go down, then of course demand is rising faster than supply, given that demand is going up and supply is going down. When supply goes down, that's going to make quantity go down and price go up. So you know for sure, without a doubt, that prices are going to go up. And essentially that's what we're talking about when it comes to inflation. Of course, in this case, the effect on quantity is going to be ambiguous. Right? So at least we don't know which effect is stronger. So again, you know that prices are going to go up, and that's what happens if demand's going up and supply is going down, right? So again, we're talking about the price index. We're really talking about the price of all things. So if we're talking about demand in general for all or most things, and supply in general for all or most things, if demand is going up while supply is going down, that is going to make that price go up, right? Now, even if you had a case where demand was going up, again, making quantity go up and price go up, but then you had supply that's also going up, which remember is going to make our quantity go up and our price go down. In this case, you know for sure that the quantity of items that are going to be bought and sold are going to go up. But again, the effect on price would be ambiguous if you don't know which effect is stronger. But if I tell you that demand rises faster than supply, then now I'm telling you that we know which effect is stronger. In other words, that demand effect is stronger. And if the demand effect is stronger, then again, even when both demand and supply are going up, if demand's rising faster than supply, then that's going to make price go up. So again, if demand is going faster than supply, or people are wanting goods and services more than there are goods and services being produced, then that's going to make prices increase, and that could lead to some inflation. Now, the more common and most frequent cause of inflation is a rapid increase in the money stock, which is when the central bank of a particular country prints out and injects a lot of money into the economy. And we're going to talk about how they do that in chapters 13 and 14, the last two chapters of this class. But in other words, if the amount of money that's floating around or the amount of currency that's circulating throughout the economy increases faster than the amount of goods and services that are circulating throughout an economy, then you're also going to have inflation. And this is how inflation, particularly hyperinflation, is usually caused. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and talk about a couple of examples of that. So let's look at hyperinflation in Germany between 1922 and 1923. Right, so for those of you whose history might be a bit hazy, right, Germany was one of the countries that was blamed for starting World War I, and therefore when Germany and the Axis powers lost that particular war, the Allied powers demanded that Germany make substantial reparation payments to these other countries. So you can imagine Germany just lost this war. They've been destroyed by this havoc caused by the war, so they don't really have a lot of productive capacity given that they've been bombed and fought against by the pretty much most of the world, right? So they don't really have the money to pay France for the damage that they caused to France during the war, or to pay to England for the damage they might have caused England during the war, right? In other words, Germany doesn't have the money to make these reparation payments, but these Allied powers have ordered it. So the only way that Germany can make these payments is by printing off large quantities of money, and in doing so, create this hyperinflation that we've been talking about. It's kind of an interesting historical note that economist John Maynard Keynes, who we're going to talk a lot about in Chapter 11, warned the Allied powers against doing this, saying that it would only further alienate Germany, saying, look, we need to kind of bring Germany into the fold, kind of make them feel like they are a part of our group, rather than making them make these reparation payments, because doing that's only going to hurt them further and kind of make them more antagonistic towards the rest of the world, right? Essentially what he was predicting is that you're going to destroy Germany so much that's going to allow a bunch of bad people to rise to power, and then they're going to use this against the rest of the world in their rallying cry that we should engage in another world war. And indeed that's what happened. So he essentially predicted the rise of Hitler and World War II. In other words, if they listened to John Maynard Keynes at this particular meeting, then chances are World War II could have maybe not ever happened. Right. So the only way that Germany squeezed out this hyperinflation was through some fiscal reforms that involved cutting the number of government employees by 1/3 and adopting a new central bank at the end of 1923, which stopped the hyperinflation from happening. right? To give you an idea of how much hyperinflation was going on during this time period, right? During this 1922 to 1923 years of hyperinflation, a dozen eggs cost 80 billion German marks. So imagine again going to the store here in the United States and paying 80 billion US dollars for a dozen eggs. Right? One loaf of bread costs 100 billion German marks. And these are the kind of stories you hear where people need like a wheelbarrow full of cash just to go shopping. Right? Here's some pictures from this time period that kind of help illustrate that. Here's somebody getting ready to go shopping for the day. Again, they need this wheelbarrow full of money in order to do it. Here's some children playing with blocks of money because, again, money has become so worthless that it's actually cheaper to play with blocks of money than to use that money to buy blocks for the children to play with. Here's people throwing out their German marks into the streets just because they become so worthless. In the same way that somebody receives a penny and change today, they might just toss that penny because it's not worth it to them to hold on to it. That's what people were doing with their 1, 5, or 10 German mark notes. Given that now it costs, again, maybe 100 billion German marks to get a loaf of bread, what's one German mark really worth, right? So again, people are throwing away their cash here, their bills, because it's just not worth that much anymore, right? Now, to give you a more recent example of some hyperinflation, let's take a look at the country of Zimbabwe. From 2008 to 2009, they experienced these wild swings in inflation rate and this hyperinflation that resulted, right? So one of the problems here is they had a decline in output and subsequently tax revenue, so the government wasn't taking in as much money as they used to. And then the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, had actually given Zimbabwe a lot of loans to make certain reforms and hopefully improve their economy. And unfortunately, it didn't work out for Zimbabwe, at least not at this time. And so, again, they were collecting less tax revenue, and then they had to repay these loans from the IMF, again, with money that they didn't have. So the only way they could repay these loans to the International Monetary Fund was, again, to print out excessive amounts of money and hand it over. And again, in printing out excessive amounts of money, you're going to create that same hyperinflation type issue, right? The hyperinflation ended in Zimbabwe in March 2009 when the government just abandoned its own currency and started to adopt the US dollar as its nation's official currency, right? So believe it or not, you can still go online and buy a $10 trillion Zimbabwe note. I think they sell it for slightly under 20 bucks. So if you want to become a trillionaire in old Zim dollars, you can do that, right, with less than 20 US dollars. To give you an idea of how extensive hyperinflation was in Zimbabwe during this time period, right? In February of 2008, a loaf of bread cost 200,000 Zim dollars, right? Now that's pretty expensive, but to show you how much prices were increasing, in August of that same year, a loaf of bread, the same loaf of bread, cost 1.6 trillion Zim dollars. To give you an idea of how much inflation that is, that's an 11.2 million% inflation rate, right? So again, if you walked into the store in February to buy a loaf of bread, you don't have to pay 200,000 Zim dollars, right? If you walked into that same store in August of 2008, that same loaf of bread would cost you 1.6 trillion Zim dollars. To give you an idea of what that's done to the economy, let's take a look at some pictures from Zimbabwe. Here's somebody who's buying, looks like 3 eggs with 100 billion Zim dollars, right? That must have been pretty early on in this whole inflation process, right? Here's a kid who looks like he's balling out of control with some fat stacks of cash, but in reality, he probably has less than a penny's worth of value in all that money. He probably just pulled it out of the trash. Because again, people are throwing that much money away, given that it's just not worth that much. Right? In the same way, again, that people toss pennies today when they just don't think it's worth it for them to hold on to it. People are going to toss a 200,000 Zim dollar note when, again, it costs 1.6 trillion Zim dollars just to get a loaf of bread, right? So again, that kid probably just pulled it, or just reached in that trash and pulled out all that money to make it, of course, look like he had a lot, but given the value of those dollars, he didn't have that much at all, right? Here's one of my favorites. It says toilet paper only to be used in this toilet. No cardboard, no cloth, no Zim dollars, and no newspaper. As it turns out, it was actually cheaper to use Zim dollars for toilet paper than it was to go out there and buy toilet paper with it, which of course might lead to some uncomfortable situations. And then finally, non-Zimbabwean residents, please note that you are required to settle your bill in your foreign currency. So again, if you are somebody living in Zimbabwe, you don't want those Zim dollars any more than anybody else does because of how worthless they are and how much more worthless they're going to become in, say, a week or month's time, right? So they actually want you to settle your bill in whatever currency you brought into their country rather than in their own currency. All right, so that is it for Chapter 8. Make sure you know what that business cycle graph looks like and be able to identify which periods are expansions and recessions. Know those labor market definitions and be able to calculate the civilian labor force, the unemployment rate, the labor force participation rate, and the employment to population ratio. Make sure you know the 3 types of unemployment, right? There's frictional unemployment, structural unemployment, and cyclical unemployment. Right, remember that frictional unemployment means that you have the skills to get a job in today's economy and those jobs are available. It's just going to take you all a little while to find each other and match up. Structural unemployment means that there are jobs available, but you don't have the skills necessary to get the jobs in today's economy. And then that cyclical unemployment means that you're out there with the skills ready to work, but there are no jobs available because we are in a recession or an economic downturn. Make sure you know the natural rate of unemployment and the actual rate of unemployment and how they relate to one another when it comes to business cycles. Right? Remember that the natural rate is just your structural unemployment plus your frictional unemployment, whereas the actual rate is all 3, structural, frictional, and cyclical added together. Right? When we are in an expansion, your unemployment is lower than usual, so the actual rate of unemployment will be less than the natural rate. When we are in a recession, unemployment is higher than usual, so the actual rate will be greater than the natural rate. When we are in a situation known as full employment, that means that the natural rate will be equal to the actual rate, or your cyclical unemployment will be equal to 0. All right, so again, none of those relate to the business cycle. Now, potential output relates to actual output with regards to the business cycle. Again, if we are in an expansion, your actual output will be greater than your potential output. If you are in a recession, your actual output will be less than your potential output. Again, the potential output is just the most output that you can sustain for a long period of time. Or again, the economy's normal operating rate when it's not in an expansion or not in a recession. Be able to calculate the inflation rate as the new minus the old divided by the old. Remember that inflation is caused whenever demand rises faster than supply, or whenever we print out more money than there are goods and services around in the economy that money is trying to buy. And then finally, know the problems caused by inflation. Right? We talked about how it reduces investment, how it distorts the information delivered by prices, and how it results in a less productive use of resources as you spend more time and effort trying to protect your resources from inflation rather than using that time and effort to, say, make your products faster, better, or cheaper. Right, so that's it for Chapter 8. As always, feel free to let me know if you have any questions. You can shoot me that email or come visit me during those Zoom office hours. All right, again, just let me know if you need anything. Have a good one and take care.